We'll go ahead and get started, everyone. Welcome to a new week and a beautiful day. Thanks for taking time out of this 70-degree February day in Louisville and joining us. My name is David Buckley. I am the Paul Weber Endowed Chair of Politics, Science, and Religion here in the Political Science Department, and also Director of the Center for Asian Democracy, which is glad to be hosting our talk today. Just before I introduce today's speaker, a couple of orders of business. First of all, for those online, we think the slides will be showing up pretty effectively today. We closed some side blinds, but if some of the slides are difficult to follow, we will be able to post these, we think, after the fact to those who are watching online. So we apologize if that's the case, but hopefully they'll be relatively visible today. We will also monitor the chat during Q&A, so if you're online and have questions, feel free to type them in at any time, and we'll keep an eye on them during the Q&A period. Before introducing today's speaker, I'll also just announce our next upcoming event through CAD. So next week, on Tuesday, March 5th, we'll have a little bit of a different kind of event. Our annual lecture in Asian Democracy, large flyer here, smaller flyers scattered around the room, and also on our social media feeds and website. We're very, very glad to be welcoming Patricia Evangelista to Louisville. Pat is the author of a very important new book called Some People Need Killing, about violence in the Philippine drug war. It's a book that was named Time Magazine's Best Work of Nonfiction of 2023 and a New York Times Top 10 book of 2023. Her reporting in the midst of the drug war was really some of the first intensive investigative journalism associated with it, and then this book kind of sums that up. This is not going to be an event here in Ford Hall. It'll be a public event over in the Speed Museum on Tuesday afternoon at 4 p.m. So the talk and Q&A will be from 4 to 5, and then we'll have a reception and all of that afterwards. So I really hope that you all can join, and feel free to spread the word. Okay, without any further ado then, let's get on to today's main event, where we'll be looking not at the Philippines, but at China. We're very, very glad to be joined by Professor Lynette, a political scientist, China and Asia specialist at the University of Toronto, who researches authoritarianism, contention, and development. She's professor of political science at Toronto, jointly appointed to the Munk School there of Global Affairs and Public Policy's Asian Institute. We've actually kind of accidentally been on quite the Canadian run here at CAD this year, so glad to have you joining, and that the weather has cooperated for all these trips. Professor Ong is author most recently of Outsourcing, Repression, Everyday State Power in Contemporary China, published with Oxford University Press. This is what we'll be hearing mostly about today. It's a really remarkable study of localized political coercion and minimization of costs on the part of the Chinese regime, and has won a number of awards, including from the American Political Science Association, the American Sociological Association, and the International Studies Association. And was recognized by the ASA for its distinguished contribution to political sociology. So it's really a really impressive, granular, close to the ground study of what governmental authority and coercion looks like in China, and that's what we'll hear about today. Her academic publications have appeared in leading journals of the field, been covered in the New York Times, Economist, Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, et cetera, et cetera. I will get out of the way so that Professor Ong can begin. Thanks so much.
Thank you, David, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm really glad to be here to be talking about my book about what I think most repression in contemporary China is actually conducted. So let me start with a quote from reading Lolita in Tehran. The worst crime committed by totalitarian mindsets is that they force their citizens, including their victims, to become complicit in their crimes. Dancing with the jailer, participating in your own execution. That is an act of utmost brutality. So the key word here is really complicity. So the book addresses the theoretical puzzle of what we know that repression usually invites backlash. So when the state imposes state repression, it invites backlash from the citizens. So the balancing act is how do you actually balance coerce compliance when you try to coerce citizens into compliance, but how do you actually minimize backlash at the same time? So how do you get the trade-off right? So that's a theoretical puzzle. The empirical context is China's very ambitious urbanization scheme. So when Li Keqiang, the former premier who just passed away 6 months ago, when he first came to power about 14 years ago, the first thing that he said was, China was going to promote urbanization as an explicit engine of growth. So by grabbing land, by converting land from agricultural usage to industrial and commercial usage, and by moving people around from producers into consumers, the Chinese government was explicitly trying to turn urbanization as an engine of growth. So urbanization rose rapidly from under 40% in 1990s to 51% and then to 66% in 2022. So with a huge rapid increase in urbanization, a lot of people have been displaced, like millions of people. So you would expect that with a huge displacement, there will be a lot of protests and maybe a movement, a land movement. So what happened in China is that there has been a lot of huge protests, but kind of pockets of protests localized and regionalized. And some of them would last for a day or two, a week or two. The most would last for a month to about 3 months. None has really come together to become a land or housing movement, a sustained movement that we have seen in other countries, such as India, such as Brazil, which has undergone huge urbanization too in the last few decades. So the corresponding empirical question that the book addresses is, how is the Chinese state able to engineer massive urban transformation in a short time frame with very minimum resistance? That is the empirical question. So the book proposes the solution of outsourcing repression. In order to get the trade-off right, if the state outsourced repression, instead of doing it itself, instead of sending its own uniform agent to do it, if the state outsourced repression to non-state actors, it could help to augment everyday state power. And the two types of non-state actors that the book addresses are violent thugs and non-violent brokers. So the nature of these non-state actors are as portrayed on the book cover. So these are anonymous individuals. These are not people that you could actually name, that you would actually usually recognize. Not someone that you could point to on the cover page of a major newspaper. These are very anonymous individuals, like everyday individuals from the street. And their anonymity, their non-state nature, and their the fact that they are not well-known figures actually helped them to get away with some of the violent actions that they do. So two types of non-state actors, the thugs for hire and the brokers who exercise everyday repression and mobilizing the masses, respectively, that helps to augment everyday state power. So you could imagine the contours of state power being reconfigured. So just kind of figuratively, if you could imagine, this is the line divides this box into state and society, and these violent actors, whom I call thugs for hire, are people who sit in between state and society. So instead of the state going out to society and repress each and every individual, if the state could hire these people that sits in between state and society, they could help do the job. So that's everyday state repression. For this, you have brokers who sit in between state and society, people who could go out and using their own social capital to mobilize people. So the state might want to convince this bunch of people to sign consent papers to land grab, to housing demolition. So it used to be the case that the state needs to go convince these people or send thugs or send officials to get them to do it. But now they only need to mobilize the brokers who sit in between them. And these brokers are people who are deeply embedded within the society, who have usually lived in the community for decades and who knows the community members very well, they could draw on their own social capital. They have their own social community. So the state mobilized these people, and they could then use their own social capital to convince this group of people. So it's a cost-saving type of mechanism for the state, and this is how mobilizing the masses work. So if you take this argument to its logical conclusion, we should imagine that the state power, the contours of state power, is then reconfigured, because the state could then extend its power deeply into society through the power of these non-state brokers that they work with. So I would like to think that the book challenges some conventional wisdom. It challenges the wisdom on conventionally what we think about state repression, which is typically those conducted by state agents, or some sort of civil society that is affiliated with state. If the state could then mobilize individual non-state brokers, then I think there is a way to rethink how we traditionally conceive what state repression is. So that would open the door to a new configuration of state state power and the extent of state power. I think the tool of the mechanism of authoritarian persuasion, which is mobilizing the masses from one non-state brokers go out there to convince another citizen, I think that introduces a new tool to the toolkit of authoritarian control. So these are, I think, what the theoretical contribution of the book is. Let me talk a little bit about the empirical strategies. So I started doing work on this book back in 2011. So I did ethnographic research. I typically spend ranging from 3 weeks to 6 months in China, typically during the summer and sometimes during winter, from 2011 to 2019. So conducted annually. My team also helped to put together an original event data set that documents land grabs and demolition cases from the 90s through to the late 2010s. So these are not protest cases. These are cases that document when the state sent certain agents to go out there to grab land, to demolish houses. What are the citizens' responses? So it's a state actions and citizen responses type of data set. And we also scrape a bunch of policy documents from the Chinese government website that collects data on policy issued by the central government and the 3 municipalities, which I've spent a lot of time in my research. So these policies talk about, the municipality of, let's say, of Chengdu would instruct local officials to conduct housing demolition in a certain way by using carrots, by using persuasion, by using blah, blah, blah type of strategies. And we collect these documents over the years. So if you like, strategy number 3 really articulates the intention of the government. It tells you what the government is thinking and how they think demolition and land grab and urbanization as a whole should be conducted. But by articulating intention, it doesn't mean that you'll be carried out the way that the government has intended. So I think strategies number 1 and number 2 that documents the outcome side of things complements strategy number 3. And this is a map of where I went throughout the years. So I started out 2011 in Hefei, which is the province next to Shanghai. Back in 2011, it was still pretty poor. It's no longer the case. Now it's a major factor there. It hosts some big factories for EVs, for electric vehicles. But back then it was still pretty poor. Then I went to Chengdu, Kunming, Zhengzhou, and then over time, towards the second half of the 2010s, I ended up in Guangzhou, Shanghai, and Tianjin. So I think over time I have a bit of a sense of regional variation and a sense of kind of temporal variation, just to get ahead of myself a little bit. I think in terms of temporal variation, over time I see less and less violent type of actions taking place. So more violent at the first half of the 2010s and less violent over time. There was also quite a bit of regional variation. There's more violence in the rural areas, more violence in the outskirts of big cities, like peripheries of cities, like in Beijing and Shanghai, would be outside the fifth ring road, Zhengzhou outside fifth ring road. In the center of the cities, there's no violence to speak of. Even in the early 2010s, because the cost of using violence in the middle of the city is actually very, very high. So so less and less violence as we move to the coastal cities too. These are some of the variations. So outsourcing repression is really a two-step process, right? The first step is the state go out there and marshal a small group of society to become proxies. That's the first step. The second step, the proxies then repress or mobilize the masses. That's the second step. So the scope condition is complicity of the proxies. So the proxies who are the non-state brokers, they must be complicit to the state actions. And with that, you have participation of a small group of society who are the proxies and acquiescence of the larger society. And in selected occasions, you might be able to help legitimize state power too. So who are these thugs for hire? They are, the nature of it is really not that different from the Wagner group that Putin hires or Putin mobilized to help to fight the war in Ukraine. But it's also very different in that sense. Because these thugs for hire in China, these are the ruffians, these are the hooligans, hoodlums, street gangsters, or legalized professionals. These are non-organized individuals who render violence as a for-profit service. So these are not professional fighters. These are not professional criminals, right? They are usually the unemployed or people who make trouble for a living. They are distinct from the mafias who abide by a code of conduct and who belong to an organization. They are also distinct from the Japanese yakuza, which also abide by a certain set of conduct, and the violent entrepreneurs in Russia. So the fact that they are non-organized, the fact that they are not armed and not trained, meaning that their capacity for violence are actually very low. So most of the violence that they conduct are actually a threat of violence, which are I threat to use violence against you if you don't do certain things, and that would usually work for ordinary citizens. A threat that seems credible would usually help to coerce certain type of compliance act. So if you compare kind of thugs for hire against other violent agent groups, you have the thugs for hire, like the mafias, they exercise private force, but their capacity for violence are also lower compared to the military, compared to the militias, the vigilantes, and the police, right? Because they are unarmed and they are untrained and they are not organized. And the benefits is that because they are perpetrators of illegal and illegitimate acts, their non-state identity offers pretense of plausible deniability. And they are hired to meet local government's unfunded mandates, right? And the costs are agency costs. So if you hire someone to do something for you, there's a chance that this person may not follow your instructions. So that's as a principal, you go out and hire an agent. There's always agency problem, right? So the agent may end up using more violence than is necessary to do the job. So let's say if you want to get this family to sign consent paper to giving up their housing, what you need to do is to threaten them to do certain things, right? But they might go out there and use violence accidentally. From out of let's say if the household were to resist and they have to use violence to coerce them, and someone get hurt, and very occasionally if someone get killed, then you would come into a huge agency problem and run into accountability issue. So in cases of accountability issue, as I show in my case studies, what you have is you get government officials in charge of corruption at the provincial level usually get removed from office. They have their Chinese Communist Party membership being removed, and they get expelled, and they get taken to court and charged with corruption, which is this miscellaneous category that could fit a lot of things in there. But what it means is that the higher level government needs to make someone accountable because something has gone terribly wrong, and for the sake of government legitimacy, someone has to be made accountable. So there are actually causes of outsourcing violence in China. Despite its authoritarian nature, despite being a communist country, the CCP actually cares a great deal about its own legitimacy. But on an everyday basis, violence, excessive violence is actually not very pervasive. Only occasionally when you have big riots happen, that's when excessive violence took place. I also document a case in Kunming where when this village authority, they outsource violence to local gangsters on a long-term basis, the local gangsters end up usurping the state authority. So much so that it has been done over a decade or so, and the village authority don't have much resources anymore. They don't have much legitimacy anymore. So when local businesses they seek protection, they would go to the gangsters, whom they call the second government, instead of the village authority. And when the local authority needs things to be done, needs to implement certain policies, they would just get the help from the local gangsters. So on to brokers. So these brokers are people who connect state and society. Because of the high cost of mobilizing every member of society, a state needs brokers to connect them with the masses. And these brokers could be divided into political brokers, social brokers, and economic brokers. So these are kind of for conceptual differentiation. Political brokers, their power comes from state authorities. They may be urban communities, neighborhood communities, or rural village communities. The social brokers, their power comes from the social capital that they command. They could be community volunteers or enthusiasts, right? So the focus on the book are actually on the volunteers and the enthusiasts, because I think a dozen or maybe two dozen of China's books has been written about neighborhood communities, rural village communities, and urban communities, but not so much on the volunteers and the enthusiasts. And I think it's actually worth mentioning that these enthusiasts and the volunteers, they don't have any party affiliation. They don't have any state affiliation at all. So these are ordinary citizens, usually elderly women and elderly men in the 60s. These are retired people who don't usually have a full-time job anymore. They would usually be looking after their grandchildren, or participating in all sorts of square dancing is actually very popular in China, as some of you may know. So they don't have much to do about that. They actually command quite a bit of social respect in the community, because they lived in the community for decades and they know everybody, and because of their age, their background. People respect them, and if the state could mobilize them to do certain things, they could go out there and convince people without the cost of using violence, without any coercion at all. So they are actually important people in the community. Economic brokers, their power comes from their capacity to reduce information asymmetry and to match supply and demand. So these are profit-seeking intermediaries in between state and society. So the way to think about them, so this is from cases in Shanghai. In Shanghai, they are called 黄牛, literally means cattle. The way to think about them are they are like ticket scalpers in our society, right? So if you want to go get tickets to certain concerts, these days ticket scalping has gone online. You can go online and buy tickets, let's say to YouTube concerts at 3 times the price of its face value. And some people will pay for double or triple the price if they really want to see a concert. Or you could go to the concert venue an hour or 2 earlier and see some people walking around with spare tickets who are going to sell it to you at extraordinary prices. And the reason why these ticket scalpers have access to these extra tickets, which are not available anymore from formal channels, is because they have access to the ticket office. So this is a backdoor access to the ticket office. So they have connection with people in the ticket office. Same case with the economic brokers here. So economic brokers are ordinary citizens. These are ordinary citizens, but pretty astute individuals. Typically, I've come across people in the late 40s and early 50s. They have undergone housing demolition themselves, so they know how the game works. And in the case of housing demolition, local authorities are usually under a lot of pressure to get the project done because they borrow money from banks to get the project going. And they're under pressure from higher level government to get it done as quickly as possible. And they usually set aside a pool of money to pacify people, to pacify the troublemakers, to pacify the protesters. So these economic brokers will advertise to people undergoing demolition. They say that if you work with me, I can help you to secure extra compensation. And in the process of securing extra compensation, what they do is they help to produce a suite of services, which includes fake certificates, fake birth certificates, because compensation is based on a calculation, a set of formula. The formula includes the number of people in the household. So if you have extra babies coming in, or you're expecting a child, that would entitle you to extra compensation. It also depends on single individual, and sometimes a couple is entitled to more or less. So often in neighborhoods undergoing demolition, the divorce rate is actually higher than other neighborhoods or higher than other districts in the cities, because people will often get divorced and they go through demolition, get compensation, and after that they get married back to the same person. It's a way of playing the games in order to maximize their entitlement. And in places like Shanghai, this extra compensation can actually be worth a lot of money. You know, the housing prices in Shanghai is very, very high, as high as New York City. By having gain an extra apartment, let's say, could feed your family for another generation without having to work. So it actually makes a great deal of difference. So these brokers will work with people in the demolition office. So let's say if they were to get an extra apartment and an X million of dollars out of that, they will split 50-50 between their clients, who are the citizens, and the other 50 is split with the brokers as well as people in the demolition office. So it's a corrupt deal. It's a corrupt deal. But citizens cannot bribe demolition officers directly, because that's dangerous. You don't know whether they are actually bribable. If they are not bribable, you may be charged for bribery. but they can work with someone who could help to forge this patron-client type of relationship. So, everyone gets a cut. Everyone gets a cut, and they get the paperwork done with all sorts of fake certificates, which helps to fulfill the process. So no one has an incentive kind of to become a whistleblower. These are the three types of brokers. So the way to think about them is, so the brokerage literature is actually pervasive in comparative politics, but in China, less so. We typically think about country being consisting of the state and society, but if you were to pull aside these two layers, we can squeeze out this middle layer of brokerage, well, political brokers, social brokers, and economic brokers. I would argue that the book argues that it actually plays a huge role in how the state functions. And the way to think about it is an octopus. You can think about an octopus being very powerful. But the reason why the octopus is powerful is because of its tentacles. And these brokers are like the tentacles that gives power to the octopus, that allows it to swim around and really to penetrate society and to grip society and to implement and coerce a lot of policies without inviting much of a backlash. So this is from the data set where you have government officials, the police, and thugs being sent, and also government officials being sent, the number of times they are present to conduct violent incidents. And the thugs are sent as the third most frequent type of agent. Despite the high incidence of violent incidents they are involved in, this is the marginal effects of agent type on non-violent citizen responses. So the outcome here is protest, petition, legal mobilization. So when someone come and coerce you to do certain things, you could go out there and protest, you could file a petition, you could legally mobilize. And the first bar is when the thugs is sent, when police is sent, when quasi-security is sent, and different types of government agent is sent. So when thugs are sent, it's marginally negative for protest, negative for petition, and marginally positive for legal mobilization. And it's very small compared to the marginal likelihood for the police. Also compared to government officials, meaning that when government officials were sent, they were more likely to provoke petition and legal mobilization compared when the thugs were sent. And when police were sent, people were more likely to protest. And this is a similar set of action, citizen response type of dynamics, but these are violent citizen actions. So when someone come and coerce you, some citizens might get so emotional that they pick up a knife and try to harm the agent. So that's the first set of response. Harming agent, self-harm. About 10-15 years ago, it was not uncommon that people get very defensive and emotional. They pour kerosene onto themselves and set themselves ablaze as a way of attracting attention to their plight. So that's the second set of responses. And damage property. They might start, breaking or wreaking havoc, and then breaking glasses and so on, damaging their own properties. You can see that when thugs were sent, marginally positive, but less so compared to the police and quasi-security. This is self-harm, negative compared to quasi-security and government officials. There was no effect for damaging properties compared to the police and other type of government officials. So overall, I think violent agents, when thugs as a violent agent is sent to do the job, the likelihood of triggering violent or non-violent from citizens are marginally positive or marginally negative, but a lot less so compared to formal police or formal government officials. So these are, I think, what the findings from an everyday basis, from an average basis. But there are also exceptional cases. And the case studies complement, I think, the data set in that way. The case studies look into what I would call failed cases. They are failed cases because the way that I identify those cases, because the very fact that they are reported in the media makes identification possible. So I would identify them because there has been huge protests in this city, in this district, in this neighborhood, because of a housing demolition incident that happened a year ago. Then in the summer, I would book myself a ticket to go to the site. So what happens is because of that, everyday repression, outsourcing violence has failed, which is why huge riots or huge protests then happen. So that becomes an instance of failed cases. So and then I traced it back to understand kind of the mechanism behind the failure. It is, as I've alluded to earlier, due to the use of excessive violence, which denies the benefits of plausible deniability and or evasion of accountability. And outsourcing violence occasionally also helps to usurp state capacity and leads to the punishment of local leaders. So through my case studies, I illustrate how these mechanisms work. So in the case, so this is the very first case studies. I went there in 2016. This is in the middle of Shanghai. So 2 streets behind is Huaihai Road, Huaihai Lu, which is the major shopping streets in Shanghai. So the real estate prices here are actually very, very high, one of the highest prime estate in the world. But when I was kind of walking around in 2016, I realized that this is a vacant plot of land. But this has been cordoned off. But there's a half demolished house sitting in the vacant lot. Then I did a bit of investigation. I asked around and finally found a foreign journalist who has actually done an investigation on this because he was living in one of the condominiums here, and by living in a high floor, he could see what was going on. So back in 2005, real estate company tried to demolish the entire properties. There were people who refused to move out. So what they did was, in the middle of the night, they set fire to the entire property. So there was an arson. Everyone managed to escape except an elderly couple in their 80s died in their sleep. So that arson, which then led to casualties, which then led to a huge media expose, resulted in the failure of the case. And until 2016, when I was there, the government was not able to resolve it because of excessive violent use and casualties that came about. So I talked to Mr. Chen, who was one of the people who lived in that properties. This is another case in Kunming. It's a village in Kunming. So this village locates in the outskirts of Kunming city. So Kunming is in Kunming is in southwestern part of China that borders Southeast Asia. So it's in Yunnan province. So what happened is 3 years before I went there, so in late 2010, in late 20s, land of the villagers were taken away, so they were no longer farmers, and their old houses were demolished. So they were forced to move into new housing estates. So they empty out their savings. Some of them took out loans from banks in order to build new housing. So this new housing would look like commercial housing in China, commercial housing in other parts of Asia. They are usually brick housing, 3 stories high, 3-4 stories high. They would run retail business on the ground floor. They might open a small shop or open a restaurant and live on the first floor and rent out second and third floor to migrant workers. So these people are almost middle class. They might not be very well educated because just 10, 15 years ago they might still be farmers, but only very recently that they had their land taken away. But they are by no means poor because they have got stable income from retail. They have got stable income from rental, right? Even though they might be owing money to banks in order to build the new housing, but these are not poor people, and those new houses are everything that they have. So when I was there, so this is only 2 years after the new housing were built. The government wanted to take this plot of land to build some even bigger commercial properties because they deemed it even more commercially lucrative, and with very little compensation in return. So the villagers weren't willing to barge with their new houses. There were a lot of violence involved. It was eventually, so the government sent in a bunch of thugs to loot the retail businesses, and the villagers fiercely fought with the government. And then a riot ensued. There was a lot of violence involved, and some older folks were hurt. And because of that, it was widely reported in provincial newspapers and social media as well. So much so that the deputy governor that was in charge of the province and in charge of urbanization as a whole in the province got into trouble. He was expelled from the party, charged with corruption, and eventually thrown into jail as a sort of accountability for the things that he did. So the picture here is you saw a bunch of elderly women sitting in front of an excavator as an act of resistance, because in China, people wouldn't usually hurt the elderly. They have to show respect. If you hurt the elderly, then you have committed a big moral crime and would invite backlash from society. This is another case in Zhengzhou. Its nature is actually fairly similar to the Kunming case that I described earlier. So there are about 24 villagers which were in the same plight that I described here. And I went to 5, 6 of them. I could see very similar patterns throughout. So these are kind of urban villages, what the Chinese would call village in the city, 城中村, that are usually located in the outskirts of the city. Halfway in between rural villages and urban cities. And you have some original residents that were there, but most of the population, usually around 50% to 70%, could be migrant workers. So these are migrant workers from the rural areas or migrant workers from other provinces. They would be renting housing here and work in the factories nearby or work in the factories in Zhengzhou city. So Zhengzhou House holds a huge Foxconn factory. A lot of Foxconn factory workers will be renting housing rooms from these villages. So similarly, they run retail business on the ground floor, and they will living on the first floor, and the rest they will rent out to migrant workers. Very steady sort of income coming in. So these are almost middle class. Not particularly well educated, but in terms of income wise, they are definitely not poor or destitute. And this is all they have. They don't have other properties. This is all they have. If you want to take away what they have with very little compensation, they will fight their life with it. And this is what happened throughout the mid 2010s in across 24 villages in Zhengzhou. There was a government instruction by Zhengzhou municipality that they wanted to promote urbanization very quickly within the next couple of years. So when this party secretary, when he pointed his fingers on the map on the village, the next day the village would be demolished. He he had a nickname called Izame, meaning that when he pointed his finger at the village, he will make the village disappear tomorrow. So a lot of violence ensued in these villages, and similarly, he was removed from office not long after that, charged with corruption, and then thrown into jail as a form of accountability. And this picture is a banner war between the government, who would come in here and put on a red banner saying that, we are here to improve your livelihood. Please follow the instructions. And the next day, the people would come in and say, don't you try to cheat us. And they're very daring in this sort of tit for tat sort of strategies, because they really feel that moral legitimacy is on their side. And they are doing it, everyone is doing it. Neighboring villages, over 20 other villages in nearby vicinity are all resisting against the government. It was at the time when the Zhengzhou government was very, very corrupt, very poor legitimacy. They just wanted to push through urbanization as a way to stimulate GDP growth. This is schematically how different brokerage works. This is political brokers is a top-down sort of approach. Social brokers is kind of dotted line through mobilizing volunteers and enthusiasts. Economic brokers is a double arrow bargaining type of strategy, rather than order. It's through bargaining with the state and then bargaining with citizens. This tells you different agents and different type of rate of compliance and resistance with different non-violent strategies being used. So collective punishment. So it's quite often the case that so collective punishment as a coercive strategy has an imperial root in China. If you live in the community, if you refuse to get certain things done, your neighbors might end up getting punished for your recalcitrance. So as a way of encouraging people to coerce each other to follow the state order. So when collective punishment was doled out, unsurprisingly, we have huge resistance and low compliance. Welfare punishment. The government could be giving you low-income subsidies. If you refuse to comply, then they'll suspend their welfare as a form of resistance. Resistance rates are very high. Financial reward, they might give you carrots to encourage you to comply. High compliance, low resistance, 70-30, but not as high when thought work is being introduced. So thought work, the way to think about it is persuasion, and persuasion is similar to propaganda, but it's also different. Propaganda is you could put up a banner that speaks to tens, hundreds, potentially thousands of people. So one to the masses. That's how propaganda works. Thought work is persuasion, meaning one-to-one. So you send in a non-state agent to persuade someone to conduct thought work on that citizen in order to coerce, in order to gain compliance from that citizen. So it's on a one-to-one basis. And in terms of cost calculation from the state perspective, it's a lot more costly compared to propaganda, because propaganda is one to the masses, one to many. But very high compliance rate, very successful, because these volunteers, these enthusiasts, social brokers, they know the community really well. They don't have to use coercion. They can really convince people to do certain things by saying that this is actually good for you, good for your neighbors, good for the communities. And I have a bunch of case studies that illustrates how it works. In the interest of time, let me just talk about number one. So usually when housing demolitions was conducted, let's say 20 years ago, the state needs to send in officers to convince people. If it doesn't work 20 years ago, they might have to send in gangsters, outsourcing violence. But since thought work and persuasion is introduced, they would encourage these communities to set up a self-governed renovation committee. Let's say in Chengdu, which pioneers the model. So this committee is set up by by the communities themselves, by the brokers who were given early bonuses to sign papers. So they are the first, they have the incentive. Once they have signed the papers, they have the incentive to convince others in the communities to sign papers too. And every family they have convinced, they are then given extra benefits. So the state could then take a step back and let themselves and let the communities fight among themselves. There are always conflicts involved in housing demolition, but the conflicts has become one of society conflicts, becomes one of family and family conflicts, disputes within families, rather than one between state and society, which is more costly for the government, right? Because if there's any backlash, it will come back to the government. But if this family fights with that family because they try to convince them and they don't want to, it's just families fighting against each other, and it's easier to resolve those issues. So this is what housing demolition was eventually done in the last decade or so in the name of harmonious demolition. And this is a term that everyone uses. Everyone is a lingual in the government department. It means that your demolition is done in a non-violent way. That's what harmonious means, non-violent. But harmony could actually disguises a lot of disputes within families as a result of this sort of policies. And the case of profit-seeking brokers is also part of it. So in the concluding, the chapter before concluding chapter, I looked at South Korea pre and post 87, where it democratized as a most similar case studies. I think pre-democratized South Korea is actually very, very similar to contemporary China. The Seoul government wanted to evict a bunch of slum dwellers, to clear a major slum in Seoul City in preparation for Asian Games. They also similarly hired gangsters to do so. I think India poses a very dissimilar case studies. You also have a lot of slums in India, which are kind of ruled by the gundas, the violent agents. But these violent agents, these gundas, they could gather vote banks during election time and deliver a lot of votes to local politicians. So in a sense, they could bargain with the state that the brokers in China couldn't do. So they are really similar, but I would say the poses the most similar case study vis-a-vis China. I also looked at Russia. Let me just end with the concluding chapter. So the concluding chapter, I apply the same arguments going to beyond urbanization to collection of rural taxes and fees and population fines in other times in China to see how it works. I talk about Xi Jinping's sweeping black campaign, which I'm happy to talk about more during Q&A, and speculate about its implications for China's political future and the future of field research in China, given its authoritarian turn under Xi Jinping. I think this sort of, I myself wouldn't do this sort of research anymore, on the ground research that I would consider myself very lucky to be able to do during the 2010s for a decade or so. And in the past year, after the book publication, I published a few articles, and most recently in Journal of Democracy, applying the same set of arguments in urbanization as used in the book, and to zero COVID policies as a form of extra mobility, of extending its argument to seek extra mobility. In zero COVID, so zero COVID was implemented for, I think, nearly 3 years in China. So first 2.5 years was very successful because they were able to mobilize community enthusiasts and volunteers to do the job. Last 6 months became violent and eventually culminated in a white paper protest, as you might be aware of. That was when Shanghai lockdown happened in the 2.5 year mark. That was when the virus evolved to such a stage where it's uncontrollable, but Xi Jinping still insisted on implementing zero COVID. So they run out of people to mobilize. So they started to hire people from the streets, just anybody. Some of them turned out to be gangsters and started beating up people during acts of non-compliance and so forth. So its sequence is actually different from urbanization. Urbanization, you use non-violent at the in the first 1.5 decades, and then it becomes less and less violent over time. Whereas zero COVID, it was non-violent in the first 2.5 years, but it turned more violent in the last 6 months out of desperation of local community leaders. So, perhaps unexpectedly, there was huge backlash. There was white paper protests were sprinkled throughout the country, which eventually, I think, forced Xi Jinping to give up the policy. So I will leave it here. Thank you so much.
I know we may have some folks who have to duck out class, so that's fine. If you have to leave for a 1 o'clock class, just leave out the back. But we can have a little time for conversation too. So questions?
Yes.
Professor Ong, when you were compiling your data from China, the state provided data, how much did you trust it?
So my quantitative data came from government policies, right? Came from two sources. The government policy documents is what the government wants the local officials to do. I take those at their face value because I wanted to know what the government wants their local officials to do, right? The second source is from media. Most of them are from human rights organizations when they were still operating inside China or out of Hong Kong. So what happened is they sometimes have reporters going into other parts of the country to document land grabs, labor protests, and housing demolition. But they also have a hotline that people could call in and say that I myself has been forced to give up my land. And there has been a protest that just broke out because of that. You could call in, or you just witness an incident. You could call in, and people will document the incident with your description. So my data set came from that sort of sources, from human rights organizations. There are also some media data, but I would say most of them are actually from human rights sources. Actually, some of them are funded by the U.S. government, and the Chinese would claim that it's actually from the CIA, but it's actually from the U.S. government. I think they have an office. They used to have an office in China, but no longer anymore. So a lot of these sources have dissipated over time. So the government policies, I took those at face value because I wanted to know what the government were thinking, right? And the other sources were largely from human rights organizations.
So I have a couple questions. When you look at this kind of almost kind of subtle forms of repression against people, I wondered if you ever thought about looking at more subtle types of repression by people themselves. I'm thinking of Scott's, everyday weapons of the week, right? So that there is repression against these kinds of policies by the government, but they are quieter, right? Things like vagrancy. You talked a little bit about the destruction of state property, just kind of mild under. It's sort of a way that the weak respond without it being protest, right, or violence. How does the government? Do you get into that at all? How does the government deal with that, which is much more difficult to identify and to respond to by an authoritarian government? You know what I'm thinking? Just like truancy and vagrancy and destruction of property and just doing things that can be very difficult for an authoritarian government to address because it's the way the weak respond to repression without it being a frontal assault like a protest.
Right. No, I know what you mean. So the book looks at the flip side of what you were saying, right? So everyday resistance, so what Scott's write about, is really the flip side of everyday repression.
Right.
So the state does all these things kind of implicitly and tacitly, which makes it, which is able to gain compliance without much resistance. Right. So it's the flip side of what you have just.
People can't respond to the state because it's done very quietly.
Correct.
So two more questions. So when you talk about economic brokers, but they're really all economic brokers, aren't they? Because they're all getting paid by the state. They all have, there's material incentives, right, for what they're doing. So even these elderly people in the community that are close, I mean, if they're not maybe members of the party, but they're still advocating what the state wants, and there's incentives for them to do that, correct? Or is it just, or are they just people that want, they want peace?
Usually they are out of the context of urbanization, they also play a role in the society, in the communities on an everyday basis, and they would go out there and help to patrol the communities, usually with very minimal compensation and often with no compensation. But they do it out of service to the community.
They not service to the state.
Not service to the community and also service to the state. So it's out of normative belief.
Okay.
So the most fundamental incentive is they believe in the party. They believe that the party is serving the community, and they want to go out there to help the party serve the community. And so it's more normative than, but in urbanization, there's so much money involved. So you would have to use some carrots to mobilize them.
And then I just have one more question that I'll finish too. And as this using sort of thugs as brokers, this is also being done in Central America by all the organized gangs. And
Right.
they do create kind of unspoken contracts with the government to carry out all sorts of nasty policies that the government doesn't want to carry out directly. They make deals, they get turf, the government gives them a certain amount of turf, they
Right.
make sure that this particular policy is being carried out. I mean, this kind of brokering is being done even by these organized gangs. in
Right.
Central
Yeah, there's huge literature in comparative context. Not in China is what I'm saying, which is I think the contribution of the book.
Yeah.
I'm aware of a lot of this literature in Latin America, in Russia, in other communist states too, and even in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia. There's been people have written about the killing field and so on in the Philippines as well.
So I just want to follow up on that. That you just about the data you talked about, but this is about everyday repression. You mentioned you used the word ethnography and ethnographic cases. I wonder if you can shed some light on your ethnographic data in the sense that to what extent do you have the direct knowledge of, say, the collusion between the gangsters and the government, or various patronage and brokerage, and this kind of, direct knowledge and what they're doing, who is employing whom and doing what, and the gangsters, saying that they are not organized. What extent that they actually there's a group or one location, whereas another is probably just completely individuals.
Sure. So before 2011, there was a change in law in 2011. Before 2011, housing demolition were very violent. Real estate companies could be directly involved in housing demolition, so they could go out there and to do certain projects, to do certain housing demolition projects, and they have hired gangsters to do it directly. But after 2011, housing demolition could only be done by the government. And after that, it has gotten less violent. There was still violence involved, but less violence over time. And I've got a chart in my book that shows that. So mobilizing of thugs for hire could be done by either government or real estate, but more so by the government in the last 2 decades. And these gangsters, they usually work with an individual who has the capacity to mobilize a bunch of people. And these are gangsters, but most of them are just unemployed individuals who don't have a full-time job, who could be mobilized to do a demolition project for 3 months, for 9 months, for 6 months. They could be paid a daily rate of 100 yen, or they could be paid a project rate. And after the project is done, these people get dismissed into society. So they are not organized in that sense. They don't work with any particular mafia groups to get the project done. Your other question was about, sorry, what?
It's about the
Yeah,
your data. How do you get hold of the data?
Yeah, correct.
The ethnography part of it.
correct. So So these gangsters are usually people from the vicinities. They are not from that particular villages, because it would incur a lot of cost on these agents to intimidate or to hurt people within their own village. But they also need some sort of familiarity with a particular village and speak local dialect, for instance. So once you work with this person, that person will go hire and mobilize a bunch of people from nearby villages in order to get work done in this village. You cannot hire someone from other province. You could do that to break out protests, but that is not usually the case in terms of urbanization, because you need some sort of local knowledge. The context actually matters in urbanization cases. But in terms of protest breaking, let's say break out labor strikes, I think it has been documented that some gangsters have been hired or mobilized from far away in order to get the job done. There's a question in the back, yeah.
Just a question about the future research, and into China, and I think you talked about like, Parliament, maybe we've been doing going in country. Is this part of a chilling effect that's going on, or do you expect a chilling effect in more research in the future, or what's the state of doing research in countries right now?
Yeah, so this is a question and an issue that actually every China scholar is grappling with. Not only for our own research, but the way that we are going to train graduate students, right? I don't think we have a good solution, a good set of solutions to that problem. We are still figuring things out. I think the country has just been open for a year after zero COVID. People are trickling back to China, but I would say only 10%, maybe 5% of China scholars have actually made a trip back to China, and most are actually quite hesitant. So as an alternative, people have started doing projects in other parts of Asia, in Europe, looking at how China works from other parts of the world. A lot of people are going into Taiwan. Hong Kong is actually worse than China because of the passing of national security law and other law which could put researchers into harm. So we don't know is the answer, and I think we are still figuring things out. I think it particularly affects those people who are pre-tenure, who really needs the data, and this has a huge impact on China studies as a whole. And I'm quite happy to admit that. I think particularly for those who are not originally from China and those who have the language background, will be more hesitant to go into China studies. So it's a turning point. Yeah.
Considering like China and other developing countries, so how far your protests are successful? So is there any success in your protest? People are losing their life, house, all those things. So if they are protesting, how far they are successful in attaining their home back?
Very, very slim. So slim that I'll say less than 10%. Getting your home back, almost zero.
Okay.
So most people protest not to get their properties back, but in order to get more compensation.
Okay. So they do get some kind of compensation.
They do get some kind of compensation. So protest usually happens for two reasons: either for subsistence, I need my land to survive. That happens in rural areas. Very little chance of success. Or they go out to protest just to create a scene or to make the local government jobs more difficult in order to bargain for more compensation. That's why protests are more likely to succeed. And that's also why they are working with economic brokers. Just to, you threaten your administrators by staging a protest if you're a TA, as a way to bargain for more TA compensation. That sort of protest is more likely to succeed in China compared to subsistence type of protest.
My second question.
Sure.
So you said there is like tug of hire, something like that. So the people hired, like the gangsters hired for the government officials.
Yes.
And then for the question the gentleman asked, so you said after all the project, they have been integrated into the society. The gangsters are in the society. So I'm wondering about their, like, after they being into the society, one point in time they have all the power, right? The thugs of higher have power to do anything in the society. So when they like after the project, how do you manage them, the government? Like they had the power and they know that the government is with me, so I can do anything in the society. So have you seen into that after effects of this power?
So my book it's not an ethnographic study of these thugs. It's an ethnographic study and other type of strategies of urbanization as a whole. So the focus are not on the thugs. But I understand the way where you're coming from in terms of your question. But to start with, these are not disciplined or specialized violent agents. These are just ordinary citizens. They are mobilized to the job because they are unemployed. They don't have a full-time job.
There comes the complexity, right? So they are normal people. So if normal people get some power, they act violently, right? So that happens in India. So if I get some power, then throughout entire my life, I will behave like that. So I'm wondering.
Not necessarily the case in China.
Yeah.
Because the party is actually very powerful. So the principal agent problem is actually very tight in China. I think comparatively, you have this sort of dynamics going on across a lot of countries. But in China, the exception is that the principal is usually able to control the agent's action. So agency problem is an exception rather than the rule.
I have two more questions.
Well, I think in the interest of time, we can wrap up. Yeah,
Right.
we can continue the conversation afterwards.
Sure.
Yeah, no, thanks
I'm
very much.
happy to chat.
Great questions, reflective of a just super interesting project, and so thanks so much for sharing with us today, Dr.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And some tokens of your visit here in Louisville. Yeah. All right, thanks everyone for being here. For folks who are online, sorry for running a bit late today, but it was a great session. Keep your eyes out again next Tuesday, 4 p.m. at Speed Museum for Patricia Evangelista. Thanks so much.